Shalom. This week's lesson in the covenant of Noah is about illicit relationships and, more importantly, sanctified unions and the idea of creating a sanctified holy union with another human being, another person, a partner, and the importance of that. I mentioned last week, in last week's lesson concerning homicide and sanctity of life, that there are three prohibitions that a B'nai Yisrael, a Jew, is not allowed to violate even under threat to his own life, as important as it is to save your own life. One is not allowed to violate certain things, three things in specific, and that would be, one's not allowed to murder another person, as I mentioned. One can't say, if someone holds a gun to your head and says, go kill so-and-so, or I'll kill you, one is, can't find another way out of it, take the bullet, rather than kill someone else. One's own life is no more important than another person's life. Another one of those three is the idea of foreign worship. One's not allowed to foreign worship. And the third, though not in that order, is illicit relations. If one puts a gun to your head, one's head, and says, go have relations, intimate relations with so-and-so, and that person is forbidden, and it might even be if that person is permitted at the same time, but we'll leave that to the side at the moment. If one is to have a forbidden relations with the person, then one is supposed to refuse even under threat to his own life. All right, because we don't do that, and we will talk a little bit about that. But the relationships between two people, a man and a woman, in the right context, can really be a source of holiness and a source of godliness, and help lead towards kedusha and the light and the Torah. And Judaism does not view aestheticism, that is, refraining from normal human conduct, such as relationships, as being the ideal. While that, on occasion, one can refrain, and one should definitely limit and frame those types of relationships, and there are limits to those types of relationships, it should not be completely cut off. We are in this world to be in this world, and one of the primary purposes of both animals and humans is procreation. In fact, that is, for animals, that is the reason for their existence, and to a certain extent, we are here to procreate and to multiply and spread. In fact, the verse in Noah tells us, right? It says, spread out and multiply, for you are surely, right? And as for you, be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundance abundantly in the earth, and multiply it, according to this translation. It was easier than translating myself, but that's more or less what it says. And Noah is commanded to, there seems to be some sort of imperative to spread out. We'll talk about whether there is an actual imperative for B'nai Noah to have children and get married. Obviously, according to the Jewish view, the Torah view, marriage itself is really simply the framework that allows one to fulfill, for the Jews anyway, to fulfill their role of having children. We'll get to whether that's, there's a debate as far as whether that's the case with Noah, but again, there are forbidden relationships, and there's a question about fruitful of an imperative, but again, I will talk about that in its context. God says it's, by the way, there's another verse, even the verse 2, right? And God says, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and the fear of you and the dread upon every beast of the earth, right? It's because one of the reasons for the flood was because there were improper relationships. In fact, it says in Bereshit Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah, the great Genesis. It's the Midrash of Genesis and the Midrash of Leviticus, Vayikra, and the Midrash of Bereshit. Rabbi Huna said, in the name of Rabbi Yosef, that the generation of the flood was not wiped out until they wrote Gimimus Masioth, right, which most people translate as either marriage contracts, marriage documents, or love hymns for unions of man to man and men to animals. Okay, which we'll talk about that in its context too. In other words, one of the major sins that led to the flood and thus the renewal of the covenant with Noah is illicit relations between all sorts of people, but particularly male homosexuality, and bestiality, which is often compared, because they happen to be right next to each other in the Torah, as far as a prohibition, both called it tova, disgusting thing. Excuse me. Okay, so now we know that the Tosaf. There's actually a debate amongst sages as to exactly what relationships between Bnei Noach are prohibited. We have the Tosefta, which in Avodah Zarah, that will tell us one view that any illicit intercourse for which an Israeli court would exact a death penalty. In other words, for a Jew, there would be a death penalty for if he engaged in that relationship. That relationship, that particular relationship, like a man and his mother, for instance, would be prohibited for the Noahide. But any illicit intercourse for which the Israeli court would not exact a death penalty, and there are many that he would just he would have to makot, he would get whipped for. That's not prohibited by Noah, for the Noahide, those particular relationships. Okay, that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. However, the Hachamim disagree, and they say there are many examples of illicit relationships for which an Israeli court would not exact the death penalty, but which is also prohibited for a Noahide. I'll get into the list in a moment. Okay. Now, in another place in Masechet Sanhedrin, on page 58a, there's a debate also between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer as to exactly what's prohibited between Bnei Noach and for Bnei Noach as far as what's considered illicit relationships. There's a lot of dispute as to the specifics. I'm going to start with one unified position of the Rambam, and then places where there are disagreements or additions I'll add on. But it's easier to start with just one of the codifiers, Rambam, who happens to bring a lot of things very easily and very clearly, and then know that there's room to play and room to debate. Okay, he brings this in Laws of Kings, chapter 9, law 5. Okay, basically there are 6 cases that are prohibited for a Noahide, right? A man's mother, a man's not allowed to have relations with his mother, with his father's wife, and the Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin was very specific that this even refers to a divorced stepmother. In other words, no actual blood relationship, but it's his father's ex-wife that has no relation to him. That's also forbidden. A sister of a common mother. Common father is not forbidden for Noahides. Specifically, that doesn't mean that it's a good thing to do. There's a lot of things that are permitted that aren't good things to do. I mean, first cousins are technically permitted, but we know biologically that that's not a good thing to do. Other things, all right? Another man's wife, this classic adultery. We'll talk about what constitutes marriage in a Noahide society also in a little bit. Another male. A man is not allowed to have relations with another male. There are those that would suggest also that female homosexuality, lesbianism, is also forbidden. It's also debatable within Judaism as whether it's forbidden from the Torah or simply rabbinically forbidden. I'm going to move that aside for now. It's a complicated issue because there's actually no intercourse, and therefore defining it is difficult. But when we get into the more idea-oriented idea of the sanctity of unions, we'll understand why it should be frowned upon, if not wholly forbidden. Even for Jews, it wouldn't elicit a death penalty for the women. It would just be considered extremely improper, and there might be some punishment or fines or I'm not exactly sure what it would be a lav, so they'd be makot. They would get beatings for that. Okay, and also bestiality is forbidden. Now that breaks down to to 10 corresponding mitzvot within the Torah that we have codified in the Rambam and in the Sefer and in the book of Hinuch, book of education, I guess. Sefer Hinuch, that would correspond to about 10 mitzvot. So this one prohibition really is about 10 or more different commandments for the Bnei Noach. It's why I said in the beginning that really, even though there are 7, there's really more. I mean, here we got 10 for one, which is the same case for when the Jew would talk about the 10 commandments and how all 613 mitzvot are really combined in the 10 commandments. It has the same type of level. I mean, there's a lot that are duplicate, right? For instance, a man's not allowed to have relations with his father, specifically listed in the codes, which would be a duplicate of both homosexuality and things. But there's a lot of duplication in the laws. So one is to emphasize the serious nature of it, and the other is to also make sure that there's no loopholes. And it's just like in normal civil law, where someone might have done one act and be liable for several counts. Okay. The other one that's not specifically mentioned in the Rambam, but seems to really apply and is necessary, would be that any erotic conduct that could lead to a prohibited union should also be forbidden. This is the specific opinion of Rav Yosef Bavad, who wrote Minhat Hinuch, which is a commentary on Sefer Hinuch, the book of education. He brings it on. He points out that the Sefer Hinuch says something similar about theft, which is about setting up a situation that will allow for theft, which would be the positive mitzvah of 188. He says that the author of Hinuch says that all manner of men are bound by this prohibition because it is an integral part of the theft prohibition. And I believe that as a result of similar reasoning, this law too, erotic conduct that would lead to a prohibited union, would also apply to a Noahide. Okay? So, now the Rambam, interestingly enough, does not mention, in fact, I'll tell you, he has a good reason not to, but I'm going to, in any event, take up and give you the flip side. Does not mention the imperative of procreation. There is no, at least in the codes of the Rambam, any positive mitzvah that says that a Noahide has to bring children to the world. Now, you might say that seems weird, especially if you look at the verse in the whole story of Noah that says, "Hey, go out, spread, multiply, be fruitful, be a fruit." No, that's actually a sword. Don't be a fruit, but be fruitful. The reason for this, which would be, which is specifically a positive mitzvah for Bnei Yisrael, for Jews, it comes from something that's mentioned in the Gemara, in the Talmud, Masechet Sanhedrin, page 59b, that specifically states that the Noahide law does not, specifically says that the Noahide law does not feature the imperative to procreate. Now, on that same page, in that same section, there is dispute. In fact, there's a Tanaitic school. Tanaim are the scholars of the time period of the Mishnah and before, the time when there was a Sanhedrin and beforehand. There's the Tana Debei Menashe, right? That Tana from the school of Menashe, not the tribe of Menashe. Is the Rabbi Menashe, right? Who states specifically that Noahide are forbidden from castration. From castration any male, whether it be man or beast. Jews also are forbidden from castrating animals and themselves as well. And he brings that pasuk that I read earlier from Genesis, chapter 9, verse 7, spread out over the land and become plentiful, right? So, now, so So the prohibition against castration is specifically linked to the idea that they have to at least have the ability to procreate. So there seems to, if there is not a specific obligation to have children, it might be, one of the ways to resolve this might be that a Noahide doesn't have to get married and bring children, but since it's the natural course of a human person, it should definitely be channeled through a permitted union. And there's an idea that he's not allowed to do something that would prevent him from having children, such as, God forbid, castration. Or, by the way, castration would also include the surgical procedure of vasectomy, which prevents a man from having children. I don't know if today it's reversible. If it's reversible, that might be for a temporary reason, or obviously for health reasons. If, God forbid, a man had cancer in his scrotum or testes or something like that, he would be able to have them removed, because that's for saving a life. There's no question about that would be permitted. However, for other reasons, he's not allowed to castrate either himself or his dog or horse or any of those other things, because the purpose of the existence of the animals, especially animals, is their whole purpose is just to have relations. And in fact, I just heard from my friend who has a dog that the veterinarian said if they don't actually breed, then they can have all sorts of strange and cancerous problems with the womb and things like this if they don't actually use it. Which also we see this with humans too. There's the women that are prone to ovarian cancer. One of the things that's medically proven that if they actually are having children and then even if they're genetically inclined for ovarian cancer, it doesn't materialize, at least not until they stop that type of thing. So if you need to use the system that God gives you. Anyway, there are especially other authorities that also seem to not free totally anyway the Noahide from the obligation from that prohibition. The Tosfot, which are the grandchildren of Rashi, those of you that might know Rashi, in Hagiga 2a will tell you that they have an obligation for procreation. Hai Gaon, one of the Gaonim. The Gaonim were after the Talmud was closed, before the Rishonim, right? Before the Tosfot even, before Rashi, before Rambam. So a Hai Gaon writes that not alone the Israelites, but the nations as well are charged with the application of procreation. Okay, so he says it specifically. I don't know how he deals with that say what it says in Masechet Sanhedrin. He doesn't address it directly, but clearly he takes issue with it. The Ramban Nachmanides in his explanation of the verse in Genesis chapter 9 verse 5 also says that Noahides are obligated for procreation, or at least they are charged with procreation. The Radbaz, that's the Radbaz on the Rambam, at the end of that section, in chapter 10, law 6, he says, this is my rough translation, I am amazed that the master has omitted castration and sorcery. Sorcery is something else that the Rambam didn't prohibit for the Noahides, leaves that alone for now, which are both mentioned in the same Baraita as being prohibited as cross-breeding of animals and trees, which the Rambam does say that Noahides are forbidden from doing. I'm not going to get into the specifics of that at the moment, but the Radbaz seems to think, at least from the tone, that Noahides should also be, or at least he's amazed that the Rambam didn't include it, the prohibition of castration, which by extension suggests at least, if not an imperative for procreation, but at least a leaving open for that channel to be there, not forbidden for closing off that channel. And our famous Rav Ben Amozeg in Yisrael Humanat, right? He on page 667, he specifically says that Noahides have an obligation to procreate. Okay. So I thought I would just mention one other important thing concerning specific rules concerning Noahides, and then I'll talk more about the idea of holy relationships, God willing. Okay, the idea of divorce. The idea of divorce in Noahides is different than that with Bnei Yisrael, specifically in our codes anyway. Whereas we are specifically obligated that we need to give a bill of divorce, a get as it's called. The husband needs to give it to a woman to free her. This is obligation, at least in its detail, is not required for Noahides. In fact, if there is no societal rules, okay, which we'll get into more when we talk about the system of justice and the system of societal rules that they need, Noahides are always obviously able to create societal rules that they think will make their society run better. However, if a man and woman just stop living together, what we would call basically the marriage of a man and wife and the divorce of a man and wife tend to go along what we would call in common law the common wife and common divorce, where it has to do with she's no longer publicly specific for him or he's for her. They're no longer living together. They've broken up. They've divorced. Okay. That doesn't mean that she went out to the supermarket and that means she's free. It means that they're no longer considered together. According to most of our commentators, that would constitute a marriage and divorce based on they're making a declaration by their act of living together or separating themselves from each other, different residences, so to speak. Of course, obviously, which we'll get to more when we talk about the system of justices and the law and things along those lines. If the society says that a man has to actually legally give a divorce or do along all those things, then obviously that can be added, and that is probably meritorious so that people know what's going on. Even with all that going on, it's not so sure these days because everything is crazy. Gets us to one other point that Ula said. That this is in Masechet Chulin. That Ula said that Bnei Noach accepted upon themselves 30 mitzvot, but they abide by 3 of them. The first is that they do not write marriage contracts. Okay, he says that's a very important thing, something that should be carefully considered for today because of all the problems or the issues that are going on in America and various other places in the world about what's called gay marriages, homosexual marriages. They said that was one of the meritorious things about the Romans, that even though it was going on left and right, at least they didn't write marriage contracts for them. The other 2 things are immaterial to our discussion at this moment. One was the respect of Torah, and the other that they didn't sell human meat in the market according to by weight. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little bit more in this next section. We're going to talk more about the idea of marriage and the sanctity of unions, and we'll do that in just a moment. Okay. Now, the idea of marriage, the idea of sanctified unions, comes from a very important idea. As I mentioned previously, the idea, the whole purpose of human existence, the purpose of life, and the purpose of our covenant with Hashem, and our reason d'être, the reason that we are there, that we exist, is a movement between this animalistic nature and this heavenly goal, this goal of light. God gives us the covenant to try and elevate us from our base animalistic nature, which we have a potential to be really even higher than angels, because angels don't have this tension. Okay, now sexually, the human animal is polymorphous more than any other animal. There's almost, God have mercy on us, there's almost no limit to the variety of things that excite people, particularly men, but all men and women, sexually, right? There's so much garbage, there's so much stuff out there, so much garbage out there for various things. Everybody gets turned on by whatever various things. There's all sorts of things that because our very nature is at this conflict, and the intimate relationship, this intimacy, is such a powerful tool to be used for positive creation and positive elevation and light, that like any other finely powerful weapon tool, it also has the potential to pull us in the other direction. This is why it needs to be finely tuned, right? This is why one has to be so careful about not putting oneself in a situation, because it's really quite potentially explosive. The nature of man and his inclinations for bringing something that could be so holy and so full of light into the depths of the darkness, right? So, this is the idea of relationship. Now, homosexuality didn't really exist, so to speak, in the ancient world. There was an idea of the aggressor and the receiver, the giver and the receiver, and the idea was that you needed to be the one on top and not the one on the bottom, and it was very anti-women and very anti love and anti-relationship, and it had to do with dominance, and it had to do with, I mean, you ever see in the animal world, that's very much the way it is, and it was that way with Torah introduced this idea that through this powerful relationship there can be a union between male and female, which is really the ultimate goal. If we talk about the creation where man and women were created, he was created male and female, which according to the Midrash, it was like there was both the male and female aspect in the one first man, and then it was split into a male and female side, and that's why we always search for our soulmate, etc. That's our soulmate is that person that we were split from at the beginning of creation. So this potential, right? I mean, what can be more godlike than creating of life, right? So what can be more godlike than creating of life? And that's why women have the whole idea of a menstrual cycle, where there are, at least within Judaism, they are forbidden, and actually most we'll get to that. I'll get to that in a second. But there's an idea that women, who are the crucible of life, right? Also, when that potential isn't realized, and then there's this taste of death, right? The menstrual cycle, where it all flows out, and they have to wait 7 days for being clean and immerse in a mikveh to be reborn again, to renew the crucible for life. Because when we get so close to that idea of godness, of creating a human being, right, of creating life, we need to also, there's also more rules and more things that push us away to, or frame that act into a holy act of love, and holy act of thing. Now, procreation, again, needs to be framed, but it also needs to be encouraged. And one of the reasons why the rabbis talked about how the Romans and the Greeks, who were into all that stuff, into all the male homosexuality, and very anti-women, by the way, we see in almost any society that homosexuality is the norm, or is celebrated, that the relationship with women are really squashed in those types of societies, much more so than in another society. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking the Muslim world, but the Muslim world actually does honor women quite. The Arab world, which has a lot of homosexuality in it, still embedded into the culture, tends to be anti-women more so than the rest of the Muslim world. Now, you have to make a differentiation between Muslim and Arab world. And I don't want to get into Muslims or Islam or Arab societies. I'm talking just as far as elevation of women and such like that. Now, the idea, again, of a holy union, and that there's limits and framework, doesn't mean that love is limited in the emotional sense. It means that one has to frame one's attractions and frame one's love in various outlets. Back to the idea of intimate relationships. We do know that I can tell you that in Jewish marriages, through where there's limits placed within even the marriage, okay, as to when is appropriate, when it's not appropriate, about modesty, all of these things which are not specifically designated for the rest of humanity, though someone wants to take them on, they're more than praiseworthy, of course, such as modesty, covering the hair, or any level of modesty. Though there's the rules of modesty, and then there's the inner modesty, which manifests itself. Sometimes people can follow the rules and still not be all that modest, and then there's the opposite. Okay, the rules are there to try and help create an external reality, which will help the internal truth of modesty come out, and various things along those lines. It doesn't always work, but we do know that when, everybody knows when they dress up and they dress real nice in business suit or however, they feel more respectable and they act differently. Same thing with these types of rules of modesty and keeping a distance and not having two men in the same room, or a man and a woman that aren't married or permitted to each other in the same room, because we know almost anything can happen. It can happen. That doesn't mean it will happen. It means it can happen. And of course people can be above their base urges, but usually what happens is when we rely and we say, I'm above that, that's the first step into falling into the pit, because anybody can fall, as we see often, unfortunately, in the news. Even people that really shouldn't be falling, when they hold themselves. And we have the best example of this in our tradition. Solomon, King Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, who was obviously one of the greatest rulers and the greatest men in Torah Judaism, and in Judaism. Right? He built the Beit HaMikdash, he built the temple. He says, right? It says in the Torah that man shouldn't have too many wives because he'll be led astray. I won't let it lead me astray. So he had 1,000 wives, many of them political, of course. But what happens in the end of his days? Led him astray. The rabbis specify this, and they emphasize this, that anybody, even King Solomon, can be led astray. David HaMelech also faltered here and there. Everybody can falter. It's not beyond us, because we are human, and that means that we have that tendency, that pull towards the animalistic nature. Our job as human beings, and Jews and non-Jews, is to cultivate the more spiritual, the more restrained, and the more focused nature of that we have also potential, and channel that animalistic nature into permitted channels that will actually help elevate not only ourselves but our family and the entire world. We know that children growing up in a normative family that has healthy parents that cherish each other, respect each other, and things like this will grow up well adjusted, and they'll be better people, and God willing, they'll have better families, and society will be better. And if we focus on our lust and not our love, if we focus on our inclinations and not our potential, then we'll all fall. One of the big differences between the Greek society and the Jewish society was the Greek society was based on, this is the way I am. God's the way God made me, or they would say the gods made me. That's the way nature made me. That's my nature, right? Their symbol was what? The olive, right? What's the Jewish symbol? What's the symbol of Judaism, of Bnei Israel? Is olive oil. What's the difference between olives and olive oil? An olive is the way it is. It comes off the tree, and it's quite bitter if you ever have eaten an olive, okay? But how do you get olive oil? You press it, you squeeze out, you extract that golden liquid which will bring what? Light into the world. Here's blessing you all that you put enough pressure, enough squeezing, enough this, that we can all extract that golden light that's in with each of us, so that we can have sanctified unions, sanctified lives, and so that our existence and the existence of the world will be sanctified. And Shabbat Shalom.